In the fall of 1347, the Sicilian port of Messina was as busy as ever. Merchants were unloading their goods and dock workers were shouting, but on that day, 12 ships had docked in the harbor that would change the fate of the whole of Europe forever. Curious people rushed ashore and were horrified by what they saw. Most of the sailors on board were dead, and those who survived were almost doomed. Their bodies were covered in black pus-filled wounds. They were all delirious with fever and vomiting blood. The Sicilian authorities quickly took a decision. These cursed ships must be expelled from the harbor immediately, but it was too late. Death had stepped into the harbor and would never return. Like a shadow, the plague spread rapidly across Europe. From city to city, from village to village, it never stopped. At first, people did not understand the cause of the disease. Some thought it was an attack by evil spirits. Others believed it was God's punishment for sinful people. Others covered their mouths with handkerchiefs soaked in rosewater, believing that the poisonous air was to blame. But the reality was much more terrible. Death was brought by a tiny enemy invisible to the eye, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This bacterium was transmitted to humans by fleas carried by mice. When the mice died, the fleas looked for a new host and bit people, spreading the disease. When one person fell ill, the airborne droplets they breathed in infected others, and the plague spread like wildfire through the cities. For those who contracted the plague, life became a nightmare. First the fever started, then walnut-sized swellings appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. Over time, these swellings would burst and spill bloody pus. Often a sick person would die in just 3 days. Doctors were helpless. The fact that medicine was not yet developed at that time left people helpless. Treatments included bloodletting, cupping, and placing the sick in hot ovens, but nothing could stop the plague. The rich left the cities and fled to the countryside, but the disease reached them too. Churches filled with people who believed the plague was the wrath of God. Others chose a more radical path. A group of people called flagellants whipped themselves and walked the streets begging for forgiveness of their sins to stop the plague. But no matter how much they prayed, death was always one step ahead. As fear and panic grew, people began to look for culprits. Some thought Jews were poisoning the wells and innocent people were lynched. Riots broke out in the cities, authority collapsed, and chaos reigned. Streets were littered with abandoned corpses, and huge mass graves were dug when cemeteries were insufficient. In some villages, terrible decisions were taken to prevent the spread of the plague. Houses inhabited by families suspected of being sick were sealed off, the doors nailed shut so that those inside could not get out. The dead died of starvation or disease in their homes. For 5 years, the plague spread to every corner of Europe. In total, more than 25 million people died. Almost a third of Europe's population. Cities emptied, fields went uncultivated, trade stopped. Europe had become a ghost continent. But as cruel as death is, life found a way. People became immune, the plague gradually wore off and eventually stopped. But the scars it left were never erased. For those who survived, the world was no longer the same. Some towns never recovered. Faith in the church was shaken, and science and medicine began to develop. People began to look for new solutions to survive. But could the Black Death be a biological weapon? There are some records of the deliberate spread of the disease at the time. One of the most famous incidents took place in 1346 during the siege of the Genoese colony of Kaffa in Crimea. The Mongols catapulted the corpses of their soldiers who had died of the plague into the city. Fleeing Genoese merchants carried the plague to Europe on ships. This may have been one of the first known examples of biological warfare in history. Even today, some countries have the capacity to use bacteria and viruses as weapons, but whether the Black Death was a biological weapon is still a matter of debate. Today, plague is a controllable disease. Thanks to antibiotics, it can be treated and mortality rates are very low, but the Black Death's impact on humanity has reverberated for centuries. The plague accelerated the advancement of medicine, changed social structures, and reminded people of the power of nature. But remember, history always repeats itself. We don't know when and where the next great pandemic will break out. What we do know is that death sometimes comes silently and always revisits those who have forgotten the lessons of the past. Since our channel is new, please don't miss your little support.